Good evening and welcome. This is a very special evening here on April 18th on Temple Talk. And we are going to have a very special presentation by Freddie Kotek. Freddie Kotek is a native Patersonian who's going to share his upbringing in Paterson, the Jewish community, of history of Paterson, New Jersey. Freddie, of course, is a Temple Israel member of long standing, and we're delighted to have him and present tonight with all the history that he's accumulated and personal history, I might add, that he has really uncovered some really special pieces about his own background and lineage in the Paterson area. And of course, the Paterson has evolved over time, not just as a community of, not just as a community in New Jersey, but the Jewish community and how it's changed through the different eras as it's gone through the Industrial Revolution, and how it's evolved, and those that have moved from Paterson into the larger Jewish community, into the area that you may be living in today. So there's a lot of roots in Paterson to share. So I want to welcome Freddie and turn the program over to you. Again, I'll ask everyone to mute. The other question I would ask, if you have questions, please put them in chat because we don't want a free-for-all. Freddie may choose to break at some point and open up and ask for questions if anyone has any. But otherwise, I would ask you to put your questions in chat. I'll feed them back to Freddie at a later time, and he'll have a chance to answer a lot of questions. And of course, our programs run roughly an hour, but if it's an exciting audience, we certainly can go farther. So we welcome everyone this evening, and Temple Israel is delighted to present Freddie Kotek.
Thank you, Bob. And thanks for putting the pressure on. Hopefully we'll be able to fill the hour with some interesting thoughts. I'm going to share the screen here and just check with you, Bob. Can you see the screen okay?
Yes.
Great. So I guess I'm not used to doing it this way. I don't see any of your faces, so hopefully you'll all stay awake here. I'd like to welcome everybody. Wish you all a Chag Sameach. And hope you had meaningful seders and got to spend some time with your families. Tonight, and I guess I first would like to just welcome everybody on this call. From what I did see from briefly looking through the gallery before we put up the screen here, this is a very meaningful group here for me. I see a lot of old family members who I have not seen in a while. I see a lot of people from Paterson who I haven't seen in a while. A few surprises, a few that I expected. So it's going to be a very special evening for me just by having you all here. And I have a special guest out there who's joining us, a good friend of our family's grandfather, Michael Epstein. I'd like to give a special shout out to him. He is from Lodge and one of the younger survivors and few survivors. And given that we are just days away from Yom HaShoah, I never want to miss an opportunity to acknowledge those in the audience who survived the Shoah. And this one in particular came from Lodge, which was a very important part in the history of Paterson. So again, special shout out to Michael. And while I'm on that matter, my mother-in-law, as well a young survivor of the Shoah, is also joining us. So a special shout out to Rita Schaldiner, my mother-in-law. So let me start by sort of doing what I normally do. I've done presentations for 40 years, not on Zoom necessarily, but generally my presentations have all had to be in compliance with the SEC or the security regulators, because that's the business that I was in before I retired. But it taught me that with the appropriate disclaimer up front, I can alleviate any liabilities here from misstatement or facts. And so what I'd like to do is sort of give that disclaimer here before I begin the presentation or as part of the presentation, and let you know that I'm not a historian, either professionally or on an amateur level. I don't believe I've even taken a college level history class. It involved a lot of reading and paper writing, and I preferred to solve problems and do multiple choice tests. So not a historian by any way. That having been said, I admit to being an observant Jew. And an observant Jew, I mean, not necessarily ritually, but it's particularly important to me to observe and be an observer of Jewish life. And in that life, I like to see patterns and relationships and see how they all intertwine. And that's the basis for what I came up with for this presentation on Jews in Paterson. And it was, you can't imagine how much material is out there, and how difficult it is to consolidate it into a short presentation. There's some great resources out, which I'll share with you if you have any interest to do any further explanation. But there's so many different ways to approach the Jews in Paterson and Jewish Paterson and explain it. And generally, when I come up with a presentation, I like to target the audience and try to tailor something specific to the group. This group makes it both exciting and difficult because the topic is really about two things. It's about Jewish Paterson and it's about my family. And in the group of you in the audience, there's, sort of the matrix comes up is in that there are really four basic groups out there. Those of you who know me and know my family and know Paterson, and those of you who know Paterson who don't know me, or those who know my family and don't know Paterson, or those who so I think I covered all four, but you get the gist. So I don't want to rely too heavily on expecting. Okay, I'm getting a text from somebody that says you cannot see the screen that I'm saying it's sharing. Bob, do you see the screen?
Bob, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Does anybody see the screen? I've only got the title slide on. What?
We do not see the screen.
Well, we did. I did see the screen, but now.
We see Freddie on the screen. You don't have another screen on, do you?
Yeah, I do. I have the history. I have the screen share on. Okay, let me try it again.
You're not on yet, Freddie.
Okay.
I see him. I see him.
No, you see me, but I just want to do the screen share.
All right, you're not on there yet. Go back and do what you did before.
Yep, we're going to do that right now. Let's see if this comes up.
You're good.
Yes.
Okay, great. Perfect.
That's good.
That's great. Oh, now I see Jared.
That works.
Okay. Yeah. So the reason why I say that is because a lot of you are going to know the history of Paterson maybe better than what I tell. And you're always welcome at the end or at an appropriate time to correct me or add some value. And a lot of you will know my family history more than I do. And fortunately, a lot of you are on here. So you're also welcome to embellish this either at the end or if I make some, misstatement in between. But but what I tried to do is assume that there are a big group of you are my Temple Israel friends and congregants and fellow congregants. And surprisingly, having davened in Ridgewood for probably close to 30 years, it amazes me how close we are to Paterson and how a lot of people in Ridgewood are not that familiar with Paterson. And it makes perfect sense when you think about it, because when I was growing up in Paterson, Jews didn't live in Ridgewood, at least not openly. And I told the story to the shul on a number of occasions, but I worked for my dad's kosher butcher shop and we didn't deliver in Ridgewood, not because we didn't want to, it's because there weren't customers. So as the Ridgewood shul has evolved by a lot of people who've moved into the area and professionals, they never had the experience of Paterson, New Jersey. So I'm tailoring a lot of this presentation to those of you who are in the shul and to give you a sense of what Paterson was like. But in addition, what I'd like to do is tell it in a way that becomes a little bit personal in the sense that I'm going to do it from the prism of my life, right? And a lot of you, I'm sure from Paterson on this call, are going to be chomping at the bit because you've obviously seen and experienced it differently than I did, which is wonderful. That's what history is about. That's what makes this all interesting. But I can only speak to it from my perspective, which is a first generation child of Holocaust survivors, taken in by family who lived here before the war and went to and grew up and went to school probably from the peak of Paterson Jewish history and Jewish life till probably experienced it down to what I sort of deem the end, which is the early 1970s. So I'm going to give it from my perspective, and all of those who again want to will add to this later on in the presentation are more than welcome to add their perspective. From my perspective, this is what I'd like to accomplish. And if I can accomplish this evening, then this will be successful for me as well. I'd like to tell you how grand and magnificent Jewish life was in Paterson, New Jersey, during the 50 years between 1920, let's say, and 1970. And I don't use the words grand and magnificent lightly. I mean, it's going to be hard for you to believe who haven't seen it, experienced it, or know people, but there's no superlatives that I can use that are an exaggeration. It was an exceptional Jewish community. And to show you how the story of Paterson Jews were actually the story of all the Jewish people from the same period. And we'll go through the parallels, but you can discern from the history of the Paterson Jews, really a lot of, if not all of Jewish history from the period. I want to show you how the developments in world history, particularly in Eastern Europe, Eastern European history, and developments in the United States paralleled each other from about 1790 till about 1880. And then they converged and created the Golden Medina, the land of gold, and the vibrant Jewish community of Paterson. And to accomplish this, I'm going to share my family story, which will be interwoven into a lot of these events. And thanks to contributions from my family members, and Bob's aware of this, when I started this project, I didn't know some of the information that I'm going to share with you, which came to me through my relatives, and I'll give them the appropriate kudos at the time and shout outs. And so I can actually, when Bob and I first discussed this presentation, we were talking about my knowledge back to about the late 1920s, and further research got me back to 1910, and the latest research got me back to 1905. So we're going to trace back this family, and I'm going to hopefully amaze or entertain or educate you about a city that is so close to us in distance, but is so far away in Yiddishkeit, except for the memories of the thousands of people who lived it. It's just not, to say that it's not what it once was is an understatement. So let me get started with a little history of the Jewish people here, or a little history of Paterson. We're going to talk about the history of Jewish Paterson, which was really the 40s through the 70s. But to start with, we have to go back to all right, we're going to go back to 1791. There we go. It's a little slow on the uptick here. Okay. I'm sorry, but I am just want to make sure that I'm going to get my technical help here, because while I'm on one of the slides, it's not moving. Harry, you want to just help me see why these slides are not? Use the arrow. How do I go back? Okay. Okay, great. Perfect. So thank you. So I created a timeline here, and this timeline is not for all of you. You can try and read it all, but it's to sort of lay out the periods from 1790 through the 70s and what went on in Paterson, in Eastern Europe, and in my family. So the story is going to start in 1791. We're going to talk about Alexander Hamilton and why he chose to settle and create the city of Paterson. And a couple of years later, at the same time, the king through Lodz was founded in the Kingdom of Prussia, and through political reasons and changes in what was going on in both the U.S. as it relates to Britain and in Europe, both countries both areas of the world were looking to become independent, both politically and from a manufacturing point of view. And the concept of creating industrial centers in Paterson and in Lodz, which is the town where a lot of the Jews or most of the Jews from Paterson came from, but not the only one. As I've been reminded and will come up early, Bialystok was big, and Lithuania, Kovna. There were a lot of other immigrants, Jewish immigrants, but Lodz is the one, as I said, through my prism. And it was by far the one that had the most meaning from size and its relation to the industry. So during the early 1800s, the early 19th century, both towns the Industrial Revolution was happening and both towns started to develop. 1839 was a significant 1840, significant time in the history of Paterson. Paterson was already starting to boom as a manufacturing town, which we'll get into, but this is when the silk industry took off. With the arrival of a gentleman named John Ryle from England, and there are a lot of areas of Paterson and names and other things where you'll see the Ryle name, just like you will see the Hamilton name. Those of us who grew up in Paterson, there was the Hamilton Club and Hamilton Bank and Hamilton Ave, and Hamilton's name was all over, and the Ryle name was also a name that you see in the streets of Paterson in some of the homes. Jewish Paterson began in 1840, right? That was when the first Jewish settlers started coming to Paterson. And in that early group, they tended to be merchants and tailors and from Germany, Bohemia, and Hungary. And that sort of parallels what's going on in all the world. That's when the German Jewish merchants really came to the US. Those of you who remember reading Our Crowd and books like that, those were the peddlers. They went all over the South. They established the department stores. They eventually established the investment banks. So that wave of German, Bohemia, and Hungarian immigrants was the first wave. But in 1848, Jews and Poles started to arrive in Lodz as well. And that again was because of the industry getting started. So again, it's kind of parallel in the sense that both cities were founded a couple of years apart, and within about 5 or so years, the Jews started coming in at around the same time to help establish, to work. They were entrepreneurs, to build plants and to manufacture. An important date in Paterson's Jewish history, because some of the things that I'm going to sort of sprinkle around here are a few names to give you an idea. The culture of Paterson was tremendous. There were people who were entrepreneurs and businessmen, but there was a whole set of intelligentsia, artists, politicians, philanthropists. There were all sorts of people coming in and developing it. But again, through my eyes and my prism, we're going to focus on the manufacturing and the textiles, but I'm going to give you a few names of famous Paterson Jews, and know that there are a lot more. In 1869, and this we'll get into again a little bit later, the U.S. completed its first, which I guess all of you who had U.S. history in grammar school know, the first transcontinental railroad. They drove the Golden Spike in Promontory, Utah. Well, the engine that was there was manufactured in Paterson from the Rogers locomotive. In 1978, John Holland developed the first practical working submarine, and that submarine is still in the museum in downtown Paterson. And then comes the 1880s. So manufacturing is in full swing. And this is where my family and a lot of the people who brought Paterson to the next level, a lot of the Jews started coming over. In 1880s was the beginning of that Eastern European flow. It was a time of the pogroms, and people were fleeing, and there was a lot of war conflicts going on. The territory, as you do some research here, it was hard to pinpoint where Lodz was. It sort of was part of Prussia. It was part of the Russian Empire. The Tsars were controlled. Napoleon came in. It was always going back and forth. So it was a tough time for the Jews, and we started emigrating to the United States around the 1880s from that part of Europe. A significant date in our family was 1881, and you'll see why later on. But that's when my great-grandparents and the grandparents and great-grandparents of a number of people on this call, who we'll introduce later, Hindel and Herschel Reisbaum, they got married in March 7th, 1881 in Pavianets, a suburb of Lodz. Now, I'm assuming that's where the wedding was. I can't document it, but that's where they're from, and that's where our family descended from. And so on March 7th in 1881 is when I can trace our family history back to. So the 1900s come, and the Jews from the textiles center, specifically of Lodz and Bialystok, start immigrating to Paterson in big numbers. The greater Reisbaum family begins their first wave of this immigration from Pavianets to Paterson. And that is with, and this is one of the facts that I found out from my cousin Marty, who's on this call, in trying to figure out exactly when we could trace back the earliest family member. His grandfather, Abe Gernstadt, and his wife, my aunt Scheindel, although they were first cousins, so I was probably related to both of them, started coming over, bringing their families, their parents, aunts and uncles, and the Reisbaum family began to settle and stake out their stake in the city of Paterson. 1913, to show you that Paterson was just, again, like all the rest of the world in Eastern Europe, as the workers, socialism, workers' rights, labor laws, everything was at the forefront. Paterson had a very famous strike, the Silk Strike. And again, we found out that we actually had some family members participate, which I'll share with you later. Going back to the famous people, famous Jews who were coming over, like I said, they weren't all in the textile building business. 1921, Abraham Zapperstein, who later became Albert Sabin, emigrates from Antwerp, Belgium. Those of you who don't know will remember the sugar polio cube that you took. That was his invention. We'll tell you a little bit his contribution to science, and we'll tell you a little bit more about Albert Sabin. 27, Charles Lindbergh, not necessarily great for the Jews, but makes his first transatlantic flight, and the engine that was in his plane, his first solo transatlantic flight was manufactured by the Curtiss Wright Company in Paterson. So you're starting to see that Paterson was not only a manufacturing town, but it was a town that really contributed to the world. 1931, which I will share again with the family history. My great-grandparents celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in Paterson. I have a photo there that really sort of is very, very precious to me, and really shares and delineates the whole, really, you could tell so many stories from it. And it's the Jewish story of Paterson back in that time from 1905 till World War II. 1939, Germany invades Lodz, creates the Listmannstadt ghetto, where those of my family who, significant portion who didn't come, and the one part of the Reisbaum family who did not make it to the States, my grandparents ended up, and I'll show you some documents about that. When the Red Army enters Lodz in 1945 to liberate it, there were 223,000 Jews before the war, 10,000 survived. 1954, the survivors of my family, after a 4 or 5 year period in Belgium, make it to Paterson via Glen Rock, New Jersey, and we'll share some of that story. 61, as I said, Albert Sabin licenses the first oral polio vaccine. '67, after decades of deindustrialization, suburbanization contributes to the race riots and white flight. Paterson's Jewish population becomes professionalized by this time, each generation, going to school, becoming doctors, lawyers, whatever, became upwardly mobile, moved to the suburbs, they assimilated and moved out. And probably from the early '70s on, Paterson Jewish Community no longer represented what it was, except in the memory of those of us who lived it at that time. So that is sort of the timeline of some of the things we're going to discuss. What I'm showing you today is something I used to hear about long after I grew up and came out of Paterson. And again, because I want you to leave with this feeling about what Paterson meant to the Jewish people and what kind of, I don't even know what the word, ruach, what kind of spirit, what kind of just, it was everything that you can imagine a vibrant Jewish community of that size. So the people in Paterson, as they aged, maybe retired, moved to Florida, as well as people who still lived in Florida, started to organize a reunion. And this quote is, this is the headline from the South Florida Sun Sentinel in 1981. 13,000 attend reunion Paterson Day brings residents from all over. It actually makes the newspaper. This became an annual event. At that particular reunion, there were 400 people who asked for reservations and couldn't get in because they didn't prepare for it to be that large. And the story says more than 1,300 past and present residents of the city of Paterson, New Jersey, packed a reunion at Crystal Lake Country Club on Sunday. The reunion, first held in 1987, has become so popular that about 400 people who wanted reservations were turned away. In 1987, there were tens of maybe 20 or 40, just under 100. And in a matter of 4 years, they couldn't handle the reunions. I was not fortunate to be in Florida during those years, but I think there are probably a few people on the school that may want to share some of those stories. But you can imagine that what it was like. We're not talking about high school reunions, college reunions. We're talking about a reunion of a city. We're talking about a reunion of Jewish life. And there were probably more Jews, more Paterson Jews in Florida at the time than there were in Paterson. So that's just to give, again, part of what I want you to feel is just how large, how vibrant, and how meaningful this city was to the Jewish people. So I talked about this a little bit earlier. And again, without dwelling too much on the time, the Great Falls was the seed that began Jewish Paterson, or began Paterson. Alexander Hamilton had become the first treasurer. We'd won the war from the British. We had political independence, and those of you, and most of you do now know Alexander Hamilton's story because he's become such a popular figure. The fact is the Secretary of Treasury, he had a goal that we still hadn't achieved, which was, although we were independent from the rule of the Brits, we weren't independent from Britain, from England, from an economic point of view. And he wanted to create economic independence. And this is the Great Falls, and Paterson actually became, not hyperbole, the cradle of the Industrial Revolution in America. And that was some of the stuff I shared with you in the timeline. He set up SUM, the Society for Establishing Useful Manufactures. He established it in 1791. They hired a name that may be familiar to you, Pierre L'Enfant, to design the city of Paterson, but to also take advantage of the falls. And I think I thought I saw earlier Elise and Abby on the call. Elise, if you're there later on, you may want to share your knowledge. I know Elise works down at the Great Falls as a ranger and probably can really get into the details. What I will tell you about this is simply that they realized that the water from the falls and the water power could turn water wheels and would be the great place to begin manufacturing. And that's why you saw in my original timeline, they ultimately manufactured railroad cars, railroad engines, airplane engines, the cotton mills, and cloth for sailing ships, and all all sorts of industries before the silk industry took off and Paterson became the Silk City. The water wheels, they created, L'Enfant designed it, and then the Colt family enhanced it, and L'Enfant came back. But what they really basically designed was a whole series of water systems away from the falls, raceways, and different, they diverted the water to go under the factories to turn the wheels. Eventually, they created metal turbines 30, 40 years later, and they turned the metal turbines. And eventually, in the early 1900s, the falls were used to generate hydroelectric power. But Paterson's falls, those falls were really an important part of the United States Revolution, and its freedom and its independence came from the development of Paterson. And that's what began the manufacturing and ultimately the silk and textile industry, and ultimately a home for Jews from Eastern Europe. So we talked about it quickly, and I won't dwell on it. We know about the Colt. The Colts also, after manufacturing fabrics, started manufacturing guns for a few years before they moved up. But the Colt guns and revolvers were from Paterson, the locomotives, the silk mills, the engines. So Paterson was not just like, oh, the city next to Ridgewood. Paterson was a major manufacturing part of the beginning of this country and the cradle of its industry. So Lodz, Poland, at the same time in 1793, Lodz was actually a small town that was started by a bunch of clergy, and it had a very small population. And ultimately, as I said, it was going back and forth. The Kingdom of Prussia decided to annex it and make it a city in 1793. Even by 1810, there was only 190 people. But by 1815, it had changed hands, and the area became Poland, and then not Poland, and then Prussia and Russia and whatever. It was crazy, but it eventually became part of the Russian Empire in 1815. And the Tsar incentivized the people in the town, and it was a lot of German immigrants who took the incentives, tax incentives, just like we do here in the States, to come and settle the area and develop the industry. And in 1825, they developed cotton mills, much like the early cotton mills in Paterson. By 1840, the town was starting to boom. The Industrial Revolution, like I said, and the development of it as a manufacturing center started to grow, and 78% of the town were Germans. And it became the main textile manufacturer of the entire Russian Empire, they said, even as it stretched to Alaska. And the Jews and Poles started arriving 1948. So a lot of similarities. Here is just again to show you the size and the scale of it. This was the Poznański textile factory in Lodz, Poland from the late 1800s, early 1900s, just one of many you can imagine, and similar architecture that still remains in some of Paterson and their mills, but all just, again, the scale is what I want you to take away from this. The slide is very small, and I apologize. I didn't want to dwell on it too long, but if you can sort of take a look and squint, if not, I'm just going to highlight what I was trying to do here, which is the similarities are amazing. Lodz was the third largest Polish city. Paterson is the third largest city in New Jersey. They both became a city in the late 18th century. Lodz in the late 18th century, Paterson in 1791. They were both part of the second industrial revolution, and it led to the rapid growth of both cities. Their populations both grew through German and Jewish immigration. They were both textile manufacturing was the main industries. Jews arrived in Lodz in 1848. They arrived in Paterson in the 1840s. Center of the labor movement started in Lodz. Center of labor movements were in Paterson. The peak Jewish population of Lodz before World War II was probably over 500. There was probably over 500,000 people in Lodz, if not more. And there was over 200,000 were Jews. In Paterson, its peak population was around 150,000, 140,000 when I was growing up or so, and 30% over 40,000 were Jews. The current Jewish population in both cities are probably, I think I'm being fair, I'll be happy to be corrected. I call them negligible, and they're both referred to as former industrial centers. So you've seen sort of the whole life cycle of the town of Lodge and the town of Paterson, and how the Jews rode the waves. And as soon as they could, whether it was through pogroms or success or whatever, they got out of both towns. So similarities are tremendous. To show you again the scale of Paterson, the 1913 Paterson silk strike, and what I've sort of, again, one of the themes throughout this is you'll see is that Paterson and Paterson Jews, you know, you will go to whatever happened in the US and you can see it going on in Paterson. It truly was a microcosm, and micro may be not the right word, it may be macro, but it was truly a macrocosm of what was going on, the industrial revolutions, pogroms, changing borders, revolutions, workers' rights, World War I, depression, Bundists, Zionists, the war, World War II, Shoah, the post-war baby boom, the civil rights movement, everything that was going on. Paterson had its more than share of all of that, and was a very relevant city in not just in New Jersey, but in the US and in the world in some ways. What you see here is that they wanted better labor hours, better working conditions. It wasn't a successful strike. It lasted 5 months. And times as they changed, they stay the same. Technology was changing the work system. The workers were scared. They weren't getting their share. And they went on strike. Over almost 2,000 workers were arrested, and the industrial workers of the world, IWW, which was a big international labor union, their leaders were also arrested, and they were also part of the Paterson strike and helped organize it. The poster you see on the side was a very interesting thing. In New York City at Madison Square Garden, you can see this, June 7th, it's 1913, seats were $2, $1.50. They had a pageant which the participants were actually the striking workers. They went out there and they created the show at Madison Square Garden to raise money for the striking workers. So, I mean, Paterson was on the stage in New York, literally and figuratively. So here's one of the fun facts for those of you who are still awake and have not sort of been hypnotized by my droning. This is thanks to my calling my cousin, Marty Konofsky, and who's on the call, and I believe so is his sister, Helen. And I circle a picture of somebody on the right. You can see, again, I'm colorblind. I think I used light blue. It may be periwinkle. I'm not sure, but it stood out to me. And you can see on the bottom, this is the Paterson Silk Strike. This group served, every one of this group served 10 days in jail for picketing. And the first man in the third row, that circled there, whose name is Abraham Gerstadt, is part of our family. And I will tell you a little bit more about him later on. But thanks to Marty for this awesome picture and for helping me extend the family history that I can now share. Greatly appreciated. So you've sort of now heard the history of Paterson. You've heard the history of Lodge, and you sort of have a feel for what was going on in Eastern Europe and Western civilization as we know it. And they were all sort of running parallel, but really resembled each other. And then they converge in the late 1800s and the early 1900s with the immigration of a lot of the Jews from Eastern Europe to the US, like Marty's grandfather in that picture, and like my great-grandparents. And that's what I refer to as the Ricebaum family, because that's who they are. So let me show you and tell you a little bit and digress into a little bit more of a storytelling than a history lesson, and sort of how you can relate all this. Here's a picture of Hindle and Herschel Ricebaum in Paterson, circa around 1930. Like I said, they got married in Poland in 1881. And the story is, for me, this picture and part of another set of pictures that I came into my possession in 1978. Hinda and Herschel Ricebaum are my great-grandparents on my maternal mother's side. And my mother had passed away when my sisters and I were young. So we got to know her family, that we knew she had family in the United States, and we were actually close with them, but we really never got the history. So growing up as a child of survivors, both my mother and father survived the Shoah. My father through labor camps in Russia and Western Asia. My mother through Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, lost her husband and child, but both were from Pabianice. Both came back to Paterson, both came back to Pabianice, I should say, after the war. That was the story I knew. They were back in the Pabianice Lodge area, probably more like Lodge, looking for survivors. As I told you before, only 10,000 out of over 200 survived in some form. A lot of them were already moved out to displaced person camp. There was nobody there. They had to make a decision because Lodge was now part, as we said, they were liberated by the Red Army. So they were in the Russian sector. They would have been stuck behind those lines. They had heard that a lot of the people from Pabianice and Lodge who were liberated from Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen were sent to by the United Nations UNRWA to Bad Werasdorf in Germany, which is just outside of Munich, to a displaced persons camp. When word had gotten back, that's where a lot of people were. That's where survivors, if they wanted to find anybody, that's where they would be. So my father, his brother, and my mother, who were yet to be married, took off on their last adventure and escaped out of the Russian sector into the US sector, and were accepted into, and I found the paperwork online that accepted them by the UN into the Bad Werasdorf DP camp. They eventually, when they left the camp several years later, they got married in the camp. They went to Belgium, which was also in Brussels, a textile town. My father used his textile skills there as a presser, but they really needed to come to America to get started. So in 1956, they took their daughter, who was 4 years old, my older sister Suzanne, and came to the US and were taken in lovingly and by the Ricebaum family that was there. And so that's the story I knew. I knew that my parents were survivors. I grew up with a lot of the history from my dad's family. I knew my mother's family because we spent holidays. My aunts from the Ricebaum family, Aunt Betty, Aunt Mary Liss, they were like grandmothers to us. They came to our events in Paterson, high school events, and we visited them on holidays, but I never knew the story. So as far as I knew, my family history really sort of started post the Shoah. In 1978, my Aunt Mary passed away. I went to her funeral. I was 22 years old. And some of my cousins, which I'll show you, said, we're going to our grandparents' grave. And this was in Saddlebrook, New Jersey. You want to go see your great-grandparents' grave? Well, I froze in my tracks. I said, what are you talking about? My grandparents were all killed at the Holocaust. I had no grandparents that I knew. What are you even talking about, great-grandparents? And they said, no, your great-grandparents came to Paterson. They lived here, and they're buried here in the next town to where you live. Total shock to me. Went to the grave and then got these pictures, which I'll show you a little bit more of, from them. This is a little subset of the picture that I got from their 50th anniversary, which was celebrated March 7th, 1931 in Paterson. And the reason why I cut out this little picture, I'll show you the rest of it later, is the little girl in the front on the left is, in that picture was Rose Gernstadt, became Rose Kanofsky, and Rose's son and daughter, Marty and Helen, are on this call. They helped me with some of the information. That's their mom in 1931. The two people that you're looking, as you're facing on the left, are Hindle and Herschel at their wedding anniversary. The gentleman to the right of Herschel, as you're looking on the picture, is my uncle Julius, and his son and daughter-in-law, Alvin and Mala Ricebaum, are on this call. And they also helped me with the information. And Julius was the one that welcomed my parents and my sister to this country. So take a minute, take some water. Here is, you can sort of peruse this picture, which is the most amazing picture in the world in my possession. And because this picture unfolds in so many different ways and so many different stories, and the more we look at it, the more the stories add every time we talk about it. And I want to share it with you because if you wanted to get an idea what life was like in Paterson, you know, I could tell you about the 60s and 70s. My cousins, Alan Mala, could tell you about the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But this was 1931. I mean, in my life, in my prism, the world never went back this far. So to look at a picture from Paterson in 1931, you can see up in the back, there's a wedding poster that says 50th wedding anniversary, March 7th, 1931. You see the two Jewish stars on the side. Is clearly in some Jewish hall institution in Paterson. But the things that blow me away was, I mean, we came from the war with working hard for everything we owned. And I think about my grandparents who may have looked like the great grandparents in this picture, but to see my great aunts and uncles and my mother's first cousins in tuxedos in 1931 in Paterson, New Jersey, what kind of town? Like, think about the vibrancy of Jewish life in Paterson in 1931. This is just one family, but they epitomized the, you know, the true meaning of coming to the US and finding gold in the streets and success and surviving and living without pogroms. And each one of these people in this picture can tell an interesting story. And I don't even have them all. I know Cousin Al and I sit around and talk about some. I'm putting the arrow on a gentleman on the end, Cousin Benny. For all we know, whatever he was involved in, and you can think about the 30s and Paterson, whatever he was doing, he was running from a lot of people at a lot of time. The next guy over too from him was married to my Aunt Mary Osher. We know he was very involved in the socialist movement and the workers. My Uncle Julius and his sons, whatever, built a huge textile clothing distributorship in Paterson. And here he was still single and wasn't even married yet. My great-grandparents were next. The guy with the mustache here is Abe Gernstadt, and I'll show you again later if we have time. That's the guy you saw in the 1913 strike picture. So I didn't know this. This is what I'm saying. This is as I keep peeling it and finding out. I just found that out from his grandson, Marty, this week, and he sent me that picture. So when we talk about Paterson and workers and what was going on in the world and workers' rights, and there was the silk strike of Paterson from 1913. Here was my family member, my Uncle Abe, who was married to my Tante Scheindel, who was one of the sisters of Ricebaums. Abe Gernstadt was jailed and documented as a striker in Paterson in the famous 1913 silk strike. As you come down in front here, the dashing two people in the left are Marty's aunt and uncle, my mother's first cousins, Lou and Pearl, and their brother and sister, and the other young woman who I said earlier was their sister as well. And the woman behind them at the end is their sister. But these two were, this is where I first found out when I was doing research, and I told Bob Smolin when he was looking for information to put out, I said, I can trace my family back to the late 1920s because I looked at this picture and I knew if they were celebrating in 31, they must have come over before 31. So I figured it was the 1920s somewhere. But when I looked up Lou Gernstadt and found his obituary, it says he was born in Barnard Hospital. And we'll talk about the Barnard family and the Barnard name. There was a hospital I was born in. It was a Jewish hospital in Paterson. And he was born in 1910. So I knew we went back to 1910. So I had to have Bob change the info on the press release to 1910. And then I spoke to Marty this week and found out that Abe was here in 1905. So the more we find out, the more interesting it is. Next to Abe, again, so you can see from the family and the family history, his sister Pearl, my mother's first cousin. Pearl was truly ahead of her time. And in discussing Pearl, and I guess I'll get to this in a minute, but Pearl was and if you wonder what Paterson's life was like, again, we could go on for in so many different directions, so I don't want to go off in too much tangents. But she was an executive at Quackenbush's, and I use the term lightly because as far an executive as a woman could be in the 40s, and 50s, at Quackenbush's department store in downtown Paterson. But downtown Paterson was filled with Jewish retailers. Like my uncle Julius had his dry goods store, but the big department stores were Meyer Brothers and Quackenbush and Jacobs. Jewish names all over every store in downtown Paterson. And she was an executive and worked there. And she trained all the executives there who were all men and all moved up beyond her. She did all the training. And she had the foresight for merchandising, for women wearing pants and for oversized and all sorts of things. She came up with all these ideas, incredibly successful, but all the credit went to the men that she trained. But this was 1930s, and she was really a pace setter, and she was my mother's first cousin. So Paterson had, and my family had, an incredibly vibrant group of people taking full advantage of the American dream, while I had no idea. And this again is why this picture is so great, because you can't see it, but I'll show you in the moment. I'm putting the arrow below. While I was looking at this picture several years ago to show and tell the story to another relative from my father's side in Israel, I enlarged the picture on my iPad. And what I found was on the table, which I'm going to try and take the arrow and circle around here, are two pictures. And when I enlarged it, I found a picture of my mother who survived the camps. But it was my mother. Let me see if it's the next one. Oh, one of the pictures was her parents. So Hinder and Herschel Reisbaum, I'll give it to you now, sort of diagrammatic, just quickly so you understand, were the matriarch and patriarch. They had in that picture a daughter named Scheindel, a son named Julius, a daughter named Mary, a son named Benny, and they had another daughter named Sora. That was my mother, but she wasn't physically there, and she was there in a picture on the table. And that's because my mother and her husband, my grandmother and her husband, including my mother and her brothers, they went to Palestine. And this is why I say this family story is the story of what went the Jewish story of the early 1900s. They were Zionists. They went to settle in Palestine in the 30s, found it incredibly difficult, went back to Poland because they couldn't make it in Palestine. They got back to Poland, but their family was gone, not in the camps. Their family had already all emigrated, Abe and Julius and the kids, and they brought Hindel and Herschel, and they were all in the United States. Sora and Mayer went back with their kids to Poland and were never able to get out. But this was 1931 in that larger shot, and you could see that they were there in spirit. They had their picture, and on the table next to it was this picture, which I have in my possession, which I had gotten several years ago, which was my mother and her doll and her little brother. And given that my mother was born in 1917, this was 1919, approximately, she's 2 years old, somewhere around 1919 in Pabianice, Poland. And they probably sent pictures to Sora's parents, Hinda and Herschel, and Rutger's grandparents. And they couldn't be there for the celebration, but they put their pictures on the table. So I didn't even know this. My history went back to World War II and not before. But again, to see the people who suffered in the camps, and we always thought, you know, what kind of life it was in Poland. I mean, she had a lovely doll. She was dressed nicely. The family had a normal life in Poland until it didn't. But this is what it was like in Poland at that time. So everybody else was in Paterson. What I want to do here is I want to share with you something that sort of ties us all together in a very profound way. This is a book that I'm showing you here that just came out a few weeks ago from published posthumously by my cousin Ben from Australia, from Melbourne. And he died a few years ago in his late 60s, but he's from the Kotek side of the family. And the reason why I think this is important, you'll see why. I'm going to read an excerpt. This book itself is just a translation. Ben went to the Jewish Museum. There was a magazine. There were numerous magazines. This one that had the same name, the magazine was called, as you can see, Unsere Zeit, which is our time in Yiddish or German or whatever, Unsere Zeit. And it's greetings and news from Poland. So what was happening was, this really related to the Bund, to the Jewish, socialists, I guess they were not necessarily religious Jews, but they were cultural Jews and everything else. And they were very involved in the workers' union, and they would receive letters from what was going on in real time during the war. And he took those and he just published them and translated. And I want you to read so you understand again about the magnitude of Jewish Poland, and then also as it can relate to Paterson, which is the Lodz Ghetto. And it was written in volume 2, February of 1942. And it was just an excerpt from a note from Poland in Yiddish in the middle of the Lodz Ghetto, in the middle of World War II, in the middle of the Shoah. And it says, lately, there's a lot written in the German press. The Germans couldn't believe the textile industry, and they were overcome at the exhibition of it. They were not used to looking at the rest of Europe, and they suddenly saw something they hadn't seen before. The greatness of the Lodz textile industry, which was the biggest and best in the German Reich, and second in the world after Manchester. The German papers had to virtually admit that the main creation was from Jews who were 80% of the Lodz textile industry before the war. The industry was now confiscated by the Nazis, who made plans on how to give the factories to Germans from coming back from the front. The Nazis are using up the Jewish workforce. In Frankfurt, and this is fascinating, and I know, Rabbi, you have the Frankfurt connections. Frankfurt paper writes, the textile industry is most important, but not the only worthwhile factor in Lodz. A big factor is still the Jews. They are collected in the closed area of the ghetto that is bordered by a 2 to 4 kilometer perimeter wall. There are also textile factories in the ghettos. The Jews derive income from producing all types of material. The Jewish council sends the produce to the town council. They were used to manufacture uniforms, boots, whatever the Germans needed. And that's why most of them survived until the end, until they didn't, because they were slave laborers in Lodz, because the Lodz textile industry was so massive that the Germans couldn't even imagine. I know we're running out. I did an hour. I've got, I'm going to run through some slides. This is just from the Holocaust Museum. I just wanted to show you, this is actually the picture you saw, my grandfather. The arrow points to his occupation. He's a weaver. That's why he was kept alive in the Lodz Ghetto. This again is the family history. And again, as I showed you, this is Abe, the guy that was in the 1913 strike. So that's the family. Quickly, I'll run through with you because I think we need to get to just a few things on Paterson. My parents survived. Here they were in Bad Veresov and in the DP camp. They came to the US, not as a lot of people did on transports right after the war, because they lived in Belgium. They were fortunate to come on the United States. They had kosher meals. They had a gala supper with the Commodore. They came in a nice way. They were greeted by Alvin's family, my cousin's Alvin family. They moved them to Glen Rock before they moved to the 3rd Ward in Paterson, into a 6-family tenement. They had lived in life of luxury in suburban Glen Rock with Alvin and his dad and mom and brothers. My dad opened his first butcher shop in Paterson 4 years later in 1958. Paterson was a town filled with kosher butchers, kosher delis, kosher produce stores, kosher bakeries, We lived on one block for a couple of years on 31st Street between 14th and 15th Avenue. Out of 4 houses, 3 of them were kosher butchers. Here's a picture of my dad in front of his kosher meat market circa 1960, making his rotisserie chicken in Paterson on 33rd Street. And here's a typical family, my family, on the holidays, circa around 61, because my mother was still healthy, dressed up, probably going to Hebrew Free School, myself in front with my twin sister, Peggy, my older sister behind me, and my mother and father behind us. This was like Jewish life in Paterson in 1960. We got dressed up, and this was coming from textiles. My dad always talked about quality of fabric, how it was made. Clothes were important. The textiles were important. Nothing was cheap. Even if you didn't have a lot of it, what you had was good. You may have gotten new shoes for Pesach. We lived in the East Side Park section of Paterson eventually. And I just put this in because this is where Paterson had the largest Jewish population, 40,000 people at its peak. It's a historic district today. All of those of you who would love to see it, get a tour of it, I'm always available now that I'm retired to show you the incredible life in Paterson. Quickly run through some names, because again, I know we're running late, but names you should be remembered, familiar with. Nathan Barner, born in Prussia, emigrated in 1849, but not only was he a successful silk manufacturer and took advantage, as a Jew in 1883 through 1889, he served twice as mayor. He's one of only 3 statues that are standing in front of the city hall. He was an incredible philanthropist. He founded Barnard Hospital. He founded Daughters of Miriam Home for the Aged and Orphans, which unfortunately, that was 1921. So today, 101 years, was finally sold last month to a chain after 101 years. But if you wanted to know about Daughters of Miriam, Miriam was Nathan Barnard's wife. He also founded Barnard Memorial Temple and the Miriam Barnard Hebrew School. Philanthropist, politician, Jew in the 1800s, silk manufacturer, and probably the most prominent Jew from Paterson. Albert Sabin, we talked about, came from Bialystok, emigrated to the US, graduated high school in Paterson. After Salk came up with the polio vaccine originally, he came up with the way that was more effective, easily treated. And the fascinating and fabulous thing about Dr. Sabin was he never licensed it for commercial purposes. He never made a penny of it. He wanted it to be distributed as cheaply and as widely as possible. And those of you who were around in the 60s, who I remember lining up in grammar school, waiting for our sugar cube in the little paper cup to get our polio vaccine, that's thanks to Albert Sabin, a Jew from Eastern Europe who emigrated. To show you the diversity, from the arts, Allen Ginsberg, famous poet, one of the founders of the Beat generation with William Burroughs and Jack Kerouac. They founded it at Columbia University. Not only did he graduate Eastside High School, where I did and others, the greatest thing was he actually started at Montclair State University, but it was scholarships from the Paterson YMHA that allowed him to go to Columbia and achieve his international greatness as a writer. I put in Martin Friedman. I saw, and obviously near and dear to me, to my heart, is Rabbi David Panitz. I saw Sheila on the call before. I'd like to catch up with her. Sheila's father-in-law. He was an incredible man. But the reason why I share Martin Friedman's story, he was the rabbi at the Reformed Church, but we wanted to show that in the early 60s, it wasn't just textile workers and immigrants. Like you saw, scientists, artists, and people that were involved in the political movements. Rabbi Friedman was jailed with the Freedom Riders in 1960. And here's a picture. He's the one in front with the beard. But the Jews did not forget everybody's civil rights and were very involved. Paterson institutions, this is coming quick to an end. As you heard, Barnard Hospital, Daughters of Miriam, the Y, Hebrew Free Loan Association, which is still working, and Laura Brody, I know, is very involved in the Veridans Club. Still, Camp Veridans is out there, Workman Circle, Yavna Academy. More, you can't even begin to enumerate what was going on in Paterson. And Temple Emmanuel, near and dear to my heart, and my cousin Alan Mala, because this is the picture of the front steps where they met, or just off to the side of the front steps, I should say. It's a bad angle. Jacob Fabian, who was a theater owner, built the most magnificent synagogue you'll ever want to see. Stones that were the same as in Rockefeller Center, built at the same time. The main sanctuary seated like 1,100 people downstairs, another couple hundred in the balcony. On a given high holiday, between the two ballrooms, the teen services, there were probably well over 2,000, 2,500 people there. The police had to block off some of the streets from the people who weren't even inside, just mulling around. It was an incredible gathering place and a center of the East Side Jewish community. And that's it. It ended with deindustrialization and suburbanization. Our kids got rich, they became professionals, their textile industry moved out, went south, went over to Asia, and we moved on. But that's the history of Jewish Paterson. So I'm sorry I took a few minutes extra, and I'll give it to Bob in a minute. I do want to acknowledge, just for those of you who want, I think it's only fair to give credits. Image of American Jews of Paterson by David Wilson, a great book. Jewish History of Paterson, New Jersey, Kahila Links, which is part of JewishGen.org, and I'll make this available. Thank my family, the Ricebaums, the Kanufskis, the Koteks, the Gerstads, the Lisses, the Friedmans. The Ricebaums, Kanufskis, and Koteks are on the call. Jerry Nathans deserves a shout out. He was the founder and did a lot to preserve Zichron Livracha. He was the head of the Jewish Historical Society of North Jersey. Robert Polton, who was a friend of my sister's and a classmate, is the current president of the Jewish Historical Society. Plenty of information. We could go on. We could do a whole course in Paterson Jews. I hope I gave it some justice and made you just, again, accomplish, which is what I wanted, which is just to let you know that it was just a few miles from here, but it's just not what it was, but what it was incredible. Thank you.
Amazing, Freddie, amazing. I got a couple of questions for you, so don't go away. Question was, what's going to happen to Temple Emmanuel on Broadway? Has it been sold? This temple is a Goliath. It's a limestone marble arch, massive stained glass. I think this building itself symbolizes affluent, Paterson's affluence and faith and then. Any idea about that?
So if we can unmute my cousin Al, or Al, if you can unmute, if you're still on, or Mala, they are still members of the Temple Emmanuel congregation, and they will probably have the most recent information. I know they've spent decades trying to preserve the stained glass and other things from it. The building was sold, and I don't know what the status is of today, but Al, can you hear me? Or are you available? I don't know, can we unmute him? Or do you see him, Bob? Or it said maybe it's Mala Ricebaum. Do you see a Mala?
I'll check. Checking.
You know, a lot of people had dreams. I will tell you, there are a lot of people, but Mala, I hear you, I think.
Okay, well,
good.
let me explain a little bit about the
Please,
current
Al.
history, the current story of Temple Emmanuel of North Jersey. We sold that building to a very industrious Russian entrepreneur who thought he was going to provide a particular dramatic club for the temple, for that beautiful building that Freddie discussed. The problem is that he forgot that in order to provide such a building, he required parking, and there was not enough parking. So it didn't work out, and now the building is either for sale or has been sold. Temple Emmanuel currently is in Franklin Lakes. We're on Franklin Lakes, we're on High Mountain Road.
The stained glass windows and everything else.
The stained glass windows that when we sold the building to the Russian developers, the stained glass windows came with us. And we installed them in many cases in our current location. And those that were beyond what we could provide, we have stored in a warehouse. So, and we have the doors from the original temple, plus the dome. So we have maintained Temple Emmanuel of North Jersey. It'll never be what it once was, the center of Jewish life in North Jersey, but it's still thriving, and we're still involved. We continue with the fundamental traditions of Jewish life in Paterson. Thank you for that opportunity, Fred.
Oh, no, well, I'm just glad that I have the opportunity to share what your family did, our family did, and can never thank you enough. So,
Well, as an aside, my father was a very generous and philanthropic to the extent that he could, and he was very helpful, in fact, singularly helpful in bringing your parents to the United States. And you, of course, don't know this, but you don't remember it, but they stayed in our house in Glen Rock for approximately 6 months while Morris tried to learn English and the rigors of Jewish life in Paterson. And we're very proud of the 3 children. And of course, Suzanne, you and Peggy, and we relish the memories.
and out,
Can
and I will,
also-
go on. I was just going to say, just so we sort of close the circle somewhat, the Glen Rock Shul has a very large dedication, a stained glass window to Al's parents, my Uncle Julius and Aunt Betty, who brought us, and were of the founding members of the Glen Rock Shul as well. So the connection is deep.
We were very proud to do that.
Let me add, Lou's got his hand up. Lou, can you unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, am I okay? Can you hear me?
We can.
Sure.
Hi there.
Hi, Lou.
Lou
Hi,
Levine.
Freddie. I really
Hi.
enjoyed the presentation. 1984, I was single, living in Manhattan. I was working in West Paterson, doing a reverse commute. I didn't know anything about Paterson, didn't know anything about the history. All I knew was how to get from the Upper East Side to West Paterson. My father died, and I wanted a place to say Kaddish. And I discovered Temple Emmanuel in Paterson, and I went there almost every night for a year to say Kaddish, and I still have very vivid memories of how gorgeous the building was. They struggled to get a minyan, but the people who were there were very welcoming, and it was a wonderful experience for me.
Yeah.
Thanks, Lou. Lou,
Can I just say, can I just enter something?
Yes,
into
yes, please, Mom.
Jewish life
Yes.
between the 40s and I would say the 60s. Jewish life in Paterson was amazing. There were so many Jewish organizations. There were Hadassah meetings, not only in the evening, but at lunchtime, and there were auxiliaries for every single synagogue. It was so
And hospital.
hospitals and so on. It was just such an incredible time for Jewish life, as Freddie pointed out. It really was amazing.
That's what I was going to say. That was, and I'm glad I want Ma on the call. I had to give you the history because I think you need to have the foundation, but the scale of what went on, I mean, 40,000 Jews in a small area, the
Right.
commerce, the philanthropy, the organizations, it's a scale that there's no comparable today. You can in Jersey,
Right.
there's.
Sure, you're right. Freddie, another quick question is, can you talk about the why and the incredible artists who appeared there?
Yeah, we could talk about that because
Please do.
there
Please.
was Allen Ginsberg and his brother and his
father.
father, and there was a poetry reading from the Y. His father was a poet himself and also a teacher at Central High School, and it was the most amazing. That's just one thing. The Y in Paterson had so many. They had a football team when they first started. They had there's so many athletics. There was a pool in the building. There was a library in the building. We're dancing school. It was just it was busy every single day. The children And of course, Hebrew
Yeah.
school, and it was,
I was gonna say, by the time I got, started growing up in the sixties, it was still downtown. We would go down there for Purim carnivals. I think
right,
my sister went there for Sunday school. She didn't have the full Hebrew school, but
Right.
eventually in my teenage years or whatever, it moved out to Wayne.
Yeah.
But
and it
but
never was the same, by the way.
right, but it was
It
a center of a specific
Exactly.
artist. Yeah, I don't know about specific artists. If there is, that's what I'm saying. I can send you to different resources. You could, like something, you could fill hours upon the institutions and the why, but just to know that it was an incredibly vibrant cultural organization. If you go on some of the websites from the History of Jewish Paterson, the Facebook pages and the pictures, to see the size and scale of the events are incredible.
Freddie,
Also
a
earlier,
critical piece.
we
a
mentioned
critical
Temple
piece that we-
Emmanuel.
Go on.
Go ahead and finish.
We mentioned Temple Emmanuel. Temple Emmanuel had a history of being involved politically. Eleanor Roosevelt spoke there. Golda Meir spoke there. They always raised money for Israel bonds out of Temple Emmanuel. So it really was a center of Jewish life.
So one of the critical pieces, Freddie, that we can bring back to your presentation, as people are understanding, as you've explained, is that people moved from Lodge to Paterson versus other places. Tell us a little bit why people transferred from Lodge. Why did they choose to move to Paterson? What did they both have in common that made this place a place that people wanted to arrive?
So the answer is the jobs and the Jewish
Right, the
community.
mills.
The mills, the textile, the skills that they had, what they learned in Poland was easily translatable. And then once it started, it just snowballed and became a chain effect. So there was the first migration in the early 1900s, which was the people escaping the pogroms, and they came to a place where they could find similar environment and a few Jewish life, but jobs. And then, because it's always about the economy. And then once that group settled, it just became, a direct link. So even after the war, the example that I gave about my family was, they survived the war. Where were they going? They also were in the textile industry, plus they had family here. So first it was the textile industry, and then you had family and friends in the textile industry. So it was just, it was a direct and obvious place to go.
Lodz had been known as the silk capital of the world. And when the Jews left Lodz and they moved to Paterson, Paterson became the silk capital of the world.
Yeah. Lodz was the Manchester of Europe.
Right.
And Paterson silks, the word Paterson silks, even
Right.
in the
silk
80s,
street.
when I would go into Manhattan to work and I'd go through some of the garment districts or even down on 14th Street, and you would see in store window signs, Paterson silks, Paterson silks. It wasn't just that the silks were made in Paterson. The actual term Paterson silks denoted a very high quality and was world renowned.
On 14th Street. Yep.
Well, Gloria Lieberstein, who's on this call, shares that her daughter Barbara sang in the choir at Temple Emmanuel for many years. The spring concert was well attended and was well known with well-known cantors. So I'm sure the cantorial frequency was a result of the tremendous, vibrant community at the time. Do you recall any of that, Freddie?
Oh my goodness. Cantor Plitnick was replaced, but it was at the end with the Cantor David Lefkowitz, which is I believe at the Park Avenue Synagogue in New York, just retired. We could get the best cantors in the world, but you like Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, or whatever. When you did Kol Nidre, they were wearing tuxedos and up on the bima from one end to the other, this huge bima holding, I don't know, a dozen Torah. And the choir was up. There was a choir pit above the ark with stars up there, and in the auditorium with the stained glass. This was built. That's why I say Jacob Fabian, who built it, was a vaudeville and movie theater owner, and he built a spectacular theater, the likes of which were similar to Radio City Music.
Well, it certainly sounds like there was a transference from Europe to the United States between the kashrut and the demand for kashrut and the services and the synagogues and the Jewish life that flourished as a result of Europe coming to the United States. And your extraordinary program gives us more than a slice of life on a personal level, but also a history of the United States coming through World War I, World War II, and the industrialization of the United States until we come to the suburbs.
So now I see, Bob, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I was hoping they'd be on and I didn't see it before, but Shirley and Jerry Berenz are on. So Shirley's father's from hometown of my father. Shirley and I went to kindergarten together, went to Hebrew school together. Her father was a factory owner in the textiles. Jerry's dad owned a furniture factory. A lot of my father's friends worked for Jerry's dad. They are the classic example of the post-World War II Jewish community. And I see Jerry's hand up, so I don't know if he wants to share, or Shirley's hand.
Jerry and Shirley, join in.
Hi. Hi, Freddie.
Hi, Shush.
Hi. So I don't know if anyone else knows how close we were when you were growing up, but I guess I didn't realize that your father was also in textiles. And could you tell us how he came to being a butcher? I didn't know that story.
So
He was always a butcher.
that's a great story. And I will tell you, so he worked in the textile factories and even at the latter part of his life, he was actually collecting Social Security from Germany and Poland, because we proved he worked in all the textile factories. When he got to Belgium, there were a lot of people who were immigrating and survivors after the war, and the textile industry was okay, but it wasn't large. My father, as you know, as a butcher, was very fast at whatever he did. He worked hard, he stood on his feet, and he was no nonsense. He got it done. When he got to Belgium, the job that was available to him was, the term, maybe you know or not know, was a presser. So a presser, P-R-E-S-S-E-R, is what it sounds. You work the ironing machines. You had huge industrial machines that when the clothes was manufactured, that you closed to iron them. And, you weren't sitting there with a little hand iron. You worked the pressing machines. It was hot. It was sweaty. It was dangerous. You got burned. And he worked his tuchus off. And after a couple of years of doing a presser, my mother said to him, this is not a life. He learned to be a butcher while he was in Belgium. He even opened up a small butcher shop in Knock on the North Sea. He made his own sausages, and he would travel from Brussels to Knock to the North Sea to his butcher shop. And that's when they finally said, okay, we got to go to the US. So he learned to be a butcher in Belgium because the textile work that was available was too dangerous. So I really do have a specific answer to that one.
Thank you. Good story. So hello to the rest of the family. Hi. Happy Pesach.
Happy Pesach, Cheryl.
Happy Pesach, Shirley and
Um,
Jerry.
Hi, Mala.
Hi,
Good to hear- good to hear you.
Shirley. It's
Thank
Peggy.
you.
Okay, so Bob, we can end it, and anybody who wants to follow up, they know how to reach me at the
All
shore.
right, well, just let me add, Eric said that
Okay.
he knew the pressers. He says, I knew pressers. My family ran many of them in a dry cleaning business. Love those machines, says Eric. So it all seems to strike close to home.
Yep, well, that's what Paterson was. It's really an incredibly shared story, and it's just a few miles from here, and it seems like forever. Anyway,
Well, I think it's all pretty amazing, and it was an extraordinary presentation with lots of personal roots here and a better understanding of your family and of Paterson and what it was and how it transformed from post-revolutionary times through the Industrial Revolution, and an amazing part of our country's history, not just in text but in life. And your family had a role in that. So really great presentation.
thanks.
So,
Thank you so much, Freddie. That was amazing, just fascinating.
Yes, thank
I
you,
don't know
Freddie.
who that was, but you're welcome.
I'm going
Great
to stop our recording. We can continue to talk after that.
Right.